And so, having set all that up, this notion of a kind of media crisis as well as a kind of ongoing economic modernity-oriented crisis. As we've been finishing the book in the last few years, we've been reading a lot of affect theory, and as well as cultural theory. Ben, in his Cultural Feelings book, talks about Lauren Berlant, who's become a really important figure for us, the late Lauren Berlant. And Berlant comes up with this phrase. I'm going to pause before showing you the slide. Berlant comes up with this phrase in her 2011 book, Cruel Optimism, called the crisis ordinary. And it's very much a theorization of how a crisis can be continuous, and also how a continuous crisis informs the everyday and how we can kind of find it in the everyday. Um, Berlant says the crisis ordinary is the space or the mode within which people look for ways to go on living, to stay attached to life. And this is a quote from Berlant. While the present moment increasingly imposes itself on consciousness as a moment in extended crisis, with one happening piling on top of the other. Berlant also, like the mass observers before her, problematizes the notion of crisis, the kind of problems of crisis as a term. She notes that it's actually a rhetorical strategy to call something a crisis, which is actually an ongoing ordinary phenomenon. Like you think of the obesity crisis would be one example of that, where it's a rhetorical gesture that heightens the importance and makes something that actually is an ongoing problem seem acute and time bounded or like recent. Um, Berlant writes that crisis is not a kind of an acute eruption of something, but rather, and this is a quote, something structural and ongoing within ordinariness. She thus posits the crisis ordinary as the lived setting, and she focuses on how people, quote, find themselves developing skills for adjusting to newly proliferating pressures to scramble for modes of living on. And here's a kind of a concise, the most concise she offers definition of the crisis ordinary. So Berlant is a literary critic, and what she looks for in this book is, examples in avant-garde art, film, poetry, where this functioning of the crisis ordinary is visible in being expressed by artists. Obviously, what we're doing is we're finding the crisis ordinary in the writings of ordinary people, although we have prompted them to be creative, and we have framed the entire project as a creative project. It's also worth noting that, most of our writers are not economically precarious. But we do want to suggest that the crisis ordinary is an apt description of the daily landscape our writers represent, especially at certain particularly charged moments, like thinking about like the lead ups to the 2020 and 2024 elections, or the pandemic, or the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Um, the Everyday Life in Middletown archive provides a record of people making sense of the everyday by representing it. That's what the archive is. And it's marked by what Berlant calls, in the quote on the screen, stories about navigating what's overwhelming. The crisis ordinary shows up in the archive as a rhetorical situation in which people try to represent a daily life that seems blocked, disrupted, or intruded upon by threats to the ongoingness of national life, the undermining of long-held assumptions about a baseline level of political stability. This instability weakens the hold of the larger narrative forms that usually give shape to autobiographical writing: life course, career, upward mobility, individual and collective progress, which come to seem unreliable, precarious, or absent. We find the crisis ordinary to be particularly apt at describing a daily life in which shocking news, which seems to imperil assumptions and institutions long thought to be stable, punctuates the everyday through networked media, appearing unanticipated on various feeds and streams conveyed on handheld and other network devices, creating affective ripples that shape moods that our writers label to describe. And so, what you're going to see in the quotations that Jim is going to lead us through now, I think, are places where these frequent, ordinary but unpredictable upsets cause people to grapple for ways to represent them. They grapple for metaphors. They sort of find themselves between genre, or they actually expressly say that they're trying to explain a mood that they don't really understand, or whose origins they're not sure about. So I'm going to hand it over to Jim to go through a set of slides where we actually look at some quotations where people are navigating the crisis ordinary.
Thanks, Pat. So in the first example, in this next slide, um, is from a diarist who worked in Bosnia during the 1990s, shortly after the end of the Balkan War. And so this diary entry, or this portion of a diary entry, is from a September 2020 diary. So in the midst of the 2020 presidential election, there's this kind of a fervor in the country at this point in time. And so she's trying to sort of explain how to think about, or how she's thinking about this political crisis at a time when normal life was continuing. So you can see, and we've highlighted a few of the key passages and key phrases. She juxtaposes this normal life that's continuing with a building crisis, or a sense of a building crisis. And so she turns to her memories of Bosnia in the 90s, in the aftermath of that war, to explain what's going on. How people described to her a point in time when they were living a very comfortable, normal life where they didn't have to think about politics. And then suddenly, in the blink of an eye, things turned chaotic. There was ethnic cleansing, unspeakable forms of violence. And so she finds herself wondering if that's what's happening in the United States at this moment. If whether Trump and his party would turn the military against its own citizens, a somewhat prescient observation, it seems. But she also talks about how she didn't want to talk about it with other people who didn't seem to share this worry, this fear, who thought she was exaggerating. And she turns to this historical analogy partly to sort of articulate what it feels like in the midst of this ongoing crisis, but partly also to defend her thoughts to herself, right? To say, I'm not crazy about what's going on. She's reassuring herself in this example. So this is one of the places where the sort of political crisis that seems to be unfolding is juxtaposed with normal life, and our diarists grapple to say, is this part of the ordinary, or is this something more dramatic? And we have a number of other passages. This is just one example of diarists who sort of are reflecting on this kind of difficulty. If you want to move ahead, Pat. This is another one that we see variations on this theme as well, and which our writers are struggling to find the right metaphor, the right description for what's going on. This diary entry, this short bit, is from a diary that was produced just after the last presidential election here in the U.S. Last November. And so this diarist writes about things being not an untypical day, a quiet one, not much to talk about in their diary. But there was this cloud of nerve gas that was hovering malevolently around our heads and hearts, right? And so this metaphor of a cloud of nerve gas is an example of trying to find the right language, the right words, the right concepts to describe what's going on, to interpret what's going on. There's this worry that's stoked by a sense of political crisis that sometimes forms kind of ambient element of daily life. It's this background element of day-to-day life. But at other times, diarists talk about it as an intrusion that's interrupting or displacing the everyday, right? And so we see these people wrestling with how to understand this crisis. And then the last one of our favorite passages, is from one of our more creative diarists. This excerpt is also from September 2020. And he describes and compares what was going on around him now to the experience of watching a storm blow in by following it on the Doppler radar feed on my phone's weather app, right? So the whole notion of this media-fed sense of crisis. And it occurred to me that something about watching bad weather from above, from a radar's perspective, while simultaneously living it, is totally uncanny. the creeping Doppler image is almost as frightening as experiencing something bad about to happen to me or to anyone. That's what now feels like, right? And one of the key words here in our mind was almost, right? That it is almost as frightening as experiencing something bad about to happen to me. It's this sense of crisis is both there and threatening in one sense, but also there's a sense that it's removed from daily life, it's removed from the everyday, in ways that most of our diarists struggle to explain. And so a lot of what the diarists are doing in the archive, when they're thinking about or writing about this sense of crisis, is trying to explain this sense of uncanny that diarist D50 articulates. So, Pat, I'll pass it back to you now for the one more
Yeah, I've
passage.
got this is a really recent one from we actually just did a diary collection yesterday, which was going to be our last one. We're actually closing down the archival section, portion of the project. But this is from our penultimate collection. And this is someone writing about trying to explain a kind of low energy mood. And I think this one is really interesting because he makes a long list of things that it might be or that, that are contributing. He actually starts with a similar metaphor to the cloud of nerve gas, which is it's like smoke from the Western wildfires that sometimes makes it this far, the general unease that he talks about. But as he goes on, he continues to give other contributors to his mood and increase, as we get towards the end of the paragraph, increasingly they're about the political situation, right? He says, it's partly the political disintegration and corruption of the new Gilded Age. Part of it's being 58 and about being an empty nester. So it's interesting that this one also touches the public and the private, and they're really kind of almost intricately interwoven here. Part of it's a longing to get out of here, a place I don't really like or feel like I've never belonged to. Part of it is the university I work for submitting to the forces of hatred and knowing how little I can do about it. Part of it is the general waste and backwardness and a general cruelty everywhere. And then he ends with a disclaimer that this isn't the whole truth. But I think again, this is a case, a different but related case of someone trying to explain their mood and really grappling for, what kinds of metaphors or um, what the pieces of it are, right? And so it wouldn't be right to say that this is like endemic in the archive. It really sort of comes up, especially at particularly fraught moments, right? Like I said, around the election. It is interesting that this one is like, 9 months after the election. And so we're kind of wondering whether, the crisis ordinary is around more now than it has been in previous we don't want to fall prey to the seductions of social science here because we're not social scientists, right? And so we're not really doing longitudinal study. But the where we're at right now is really trying to think through how this notion of the crisis ordinary helps us to sort of think about this and um, talk about the ways that this sense of this intimately disruptive large scale crisis how people can talk about it. So we'll stop there and turn it over to Ben. And thank you very much for listening. And we'll
Thank you.
stop there.